What if toxic spikes were in Generation 3? How would this affect competitive? Who would benefit and who would suffer from such a change? Toxic spikes were a new entry hazard introduced in the Generation 4 games. One layer of toxic spikes will poison a Pokemon on switch in, and 2 layers will apply toxic poison, which ramps up in damage every turn. Flying and levitating Pokemon are immune to the toxic spikes. If a poison type Pokemon switches in, they'll remove toxic spikes from the field completely. I consider toxic spikes to be the most balanced entry hazard in the series. Regular spikes and Stealth Rock are much more powerful, dealing set damage across the board. Toxic spikes can have a massive impact, but the damage ramps up slower, and a lot of Pokemon are just naturally immune. Steel types can't be poisoned at all. This is also the only hazard that can be removed by a simple switch-in. Poison types will clear toxic spikes from the field completely, which is a very safe way to get rid of them. I think the presence of toxic spikes in Gen 4 served to buff poison types and give them a much needed utility role, while also punishing greedy defensive strategies by applying status ailments to passive Pokemon. Gen 3 OU is a delicate metagame, and the addition of certain later game inventions like Choice Scarf or Life Orb would totally turn the meta on its head. But if you were to add a later mechanic into Gen 3, toxic spikes would not be a terrible choice, and the metagame impact this could have might actually be positive. Let's explore how toxic spikes would affect Gen 3 competitive singles. But first, thank you all for helping me achieve the milestone of 80,000 subscribers. As promised, I will be doing a collaboration with Furret to celebrate the special occasion. We are currently negotiating our terms. Subscribe to the channel for the Furret content that is sure to come. Thank you. To determine who would get toxic spikes in Gen 3 OU, I'm simply going to go off the Gen 4 OU distribution. Every Pokemon that can learn toxic spikes in Gen 4 will now have it in Gen 3 for the sake of this hypothetical. There are 2 OU ranked Pokemon that would now have access to toxic spikes: Forretress and Cloyster. Forretress is already a great Pokemon in Gen 3 OU and a staple of the format, the most popular alternative spiker to Skarmory. It has a lot of advantages, with a great defensive typing of Bug Steel, which only has one weakness to fire, and access to many great unique options that Skarmory does not offer, like Rapid Spin to remove hazards, Explosion to trade with key targets, and even Earthquake as an option to threaten Magneton, who would otherwise be able to trap you. I think Forretress is the clear candidate for best toxic spikes user if this did get added to Gen 3, and it would be a significant buff to an already great Pokemon. Forretress itself is also immune to enemy toxic spikes, which is another big benefit here. Cloyster is yet another viable alternative spiker to Skarmory and Forretress in Gen 3 OU. Cloyster's popularity has dwindled over the years, despite its unique advantages as a very physically bulky spiker that matches up better into Pokemon like Swampert and Suicune than other spikers do. It can suffer from its weakness to sand and its weakness to electric, making it quite targetable and restricting its longevity. Access to toxic spikes would be, I think, a welcome addition to Cloyster's moveset, enhancing its viability a little bit. Tentacruel is another Pokemon that would be pretty significantly buffed by receiving toxic spikes. Tentacruel might look good, but in Gen 3 OU it really struggles, particularly with Dugtrio. Dugtrio is a staple of the format that is able to trap and eliminate Tentacruel with ease, and this is a problem for all poison types across the board. Pokemon weak to Dugtrio can be run alongside Porygon 2 to patch up that weakness, as Porygon 2 is able to counter-trap Dugtrio with Trace, which will copy Arena Trap and eliminate Dugtrio, keeping your Dug-weak Pokemon safe. But generally, if you're running Porygon 2 to support Dugtrio-weak teammates, you want them to be really powerful Pokemon that benefit greatly from Dugtrio being eliminated. Raikou is a common example. With Dugtrio gone, Raikou can often sweep games with its high speed, great stats, and calm mind. Tentacruel is not a very high-value Pokemon to build around with this strategy, but with toxic spikes that might change. A Porygon 2 plus Tentacruel team could actually be quite good. Tentacruel would provide rapid spin support for the team, it could operate as the team's bulky water type, and a check to enemies such as Moltres and Charizard. Tentacruel also has Thief for a form of item removal, which could be useful, so I think the addition of toxic spikes to this Pokemon's moveset might make it a more valid niche Pokemon to use. Another notable example would be Qwilfish. Qwilfish is almost good in Gen 3 OU. It does have access to Spikes and Explosion, which is already a great point in its favor. It is semi-viable. I have used it before. It's not the worst thing in the world. It has Swift Swim, granting it double speed in the rain. It can be used as an aggressive Spikes setting Pokemon on rain teams. It also has access to Destiny Bond, which can be a useful way to trade down and keep up an aggressive game plan. The problem with it compared to other Spike setters, it's just its typing mostly. It has that Dugtrio weakness. Psychic weakness is also kind of bad in a world world where Jirachi and Celebi are so common, and electric weakness is also a point against Qwilfish, as Zapdos is a common lead that will just punish it significantly. Access to Toxic Spikes would be a point in its favor. Toxic Spikes could be a different way to pressure Blissey, actually. Blissey tends to be a bad matchup for Rain, so Toxic Spikes could work with that Rain gameplay. Omastar is another Pokemon that would also gain access to Toxic Spikes and could do something similar. Another Swift Swim Pokemon with a bit more offensive merit, with a high special attack stat. Nidoking and Nidoqueen might also actually be good now with the presence of Toxic Spikes on their movesets. Having something that can generate long-term value like this would be a big deal for these two Pokemon. Nidoking in particular has a great offensive move pool, which might allow it to force switches, earning those free turns to set Toxic Spikes. Dugtrio weakness is also not the worst thing in the world for a Pokemon that can set a hazard. A common interaction seen in Gen 3OU is Skarmory setting up a spike, Magneton coming in and trapping them. This is considered a pretty even trade. That one spike will get a lot of value over the course of the game, and the Magneton also loses momentum here. The player who just lost Skarmory can switch in an offensive threat like Moltres and start applying pressure immediately, with the support of a spike to rack up even more damage. So a similar idea could apply with Toxic Spike setters. Being weak to Dugtrio is not as bad when you're clicking something that makes permanent progress against the enemy, and the Dugtrio locking into Earthquake is something that you can punish as well. Nidoking has a good move pool to threaten Rapid Spinners. Mega Horn is a high power move that hits both Starmie and Claydol super effectively for big damage. This would make it a bit unsafe for Starmie to come directly in against Nidoking and try to Rapid Spin. Nidoking can pretty easily outrun Claydol, making Claydol unreliable against Nidoking's Toxic Spike. Stab Earthquake is also perfect to threaten enemy poison types that might come in to try and clear the Toxic Spikes from the field. Steel types are also immune to Toxic, and Earthquake hits them too. You could even cover Forretress with Flamethrower or Fire Blast. Nidoking could be a good Toxic Spikes user as it will force interactions that it can take advantage of with its offensive tools. And Nidoqueen would operate similarly, but with slightly better defensive stats. Venomoth is the only Toxic Spikes setter that can learn a sleep move, which might give it some sort of niche. Smeargle has shown us how powerful sleep moves and hazards can be together. Venomoth is a bit faster than Smeargle, which could give it some reason to be used instead. Roselia is a Pokemon that has already been seen as a niche Spikes setter, thanks to its grass typing and positive matchup into enemies such as Melodic and certain Zapdos sets. It also has access to Leech Seed and Aromatherapy, which no other Spike setter does. Adding Toxic Spikes to this would be another point in Roselia's favor. Roselia is also a rare poison type not weak to ground. Roselia is still very threatened by Dugtrio because of its frailty, but at least it's not weak to Earthquake, so that's another point in its favor. Grounded poison types across the board would naturally be buffed, thanks to just being able to clear Toxic Spikes from the field on switch in. It's very important to point out that levitating poison types cannot remove Toxic Spikes from the field as they're floating above them. So Gengar and Weezing would be about the same, not receiving any significant buffs from the presence of Toxic Spikes. And what Pokemon would Toxic Spikes punish the most? The obvious answer would be Blissey. Blissey is very weak to Toxic Spikes in later generations, and that would be especially true in Gen 3OU, where it is an even more central and dominant Pokemon. Blissey has the ability Natural Cure, which heals status on switch out. But since Toxic Spikes apply poison on switch in, Natural Cure is useless. Every single time Blissey comes back on the field, it'll get poisoned again, and it won't be able to avoid getting poisoned. Using Toxic to apply poison to Blissey is already a common way to deal with it in Gen 3OU. Even though it can cure the poison with Natural Cure, this will eventually force Blissey to switch out and prevent it from sitting and healing repeatedly. Being able to badly poison Blissey with Toxic Spikes would be even more effective here. As mentioned before with the Qwilfish example, this could be a new game plan on special offense teams. Special threats really want to eliminate Blissey. It is the best special wall in the game, and getting rid of it means their game plan is much easier now. This new tool to pressure Blissey would be great news for all special attackers in the tier. Defensive Celebi sets would suffer in a similar way. Celebi also relies on Natural Cure to heal its status, and Toxic Spikes would severely restrict its longevity. Other passive Pokemon like Suicune and Melodic would also be under fire from the Toxic Spike. Suicune commonly uses Rest, which would be able to heal it from the poison, but Toxic Spikes would significantly pressure Suicune in these situations, inviting it to rest. And clicking Rest is a big commitment. After resting, you have to sleep for 2 turns, making you punishable. Applying poison to Suicune is actually a common strategy to force it to rest as a game plan against it, so being able to do this with a hazard would be much better, obviously. Melodic commonly uses Refresh as a way to deal with status, and this is actually a better option than Rest or Natural Cure against Toxic Spikes, because it can heal your status ailment in just a single turn. Natural Cure is useless against Toxic Spikes because switching back in will simply reapply the poison, but Refresh will do the trick, and not leave you you vulnerable like Rest will. Forcing them to waste a turn using Refresh every time they come in will be a big deal against Melodic though, and significantly restrict their tempo. Maybe these passive teams will start running poison types of their own to try and deal with Toxic Spikes. Venusaur is already a pretty good Pokemon with its access to Sleep Powder and Leech Seed, and that poison typing would be significantly buffed here. Venusaur could be the go-to option as an anti-Toxic Spikes Pokemon on teams like this. Roselia and Tentacruel could also be considered for similar purposes, although they are a bit more frail and vulnerable to Dugtrio. Overall, I think Toxic Spikes could be an interesting addition to Gen 3 OU, and it could be cool to see some of the lesser seen poison types of Gen 3 have a bit more usefulness now. It would also shake things up a bit, providing a form of counterplay against common defensive Pokemon, and maybe introducing some new archetypes into the metagame. This video topic was the winner of a poll on Patreon. Thank you to HollyGN for the suggestion, and congratulations for winning the poll.